a boy's heart can defy a legacy of hate. Ethan Callahan, an 11-year-old from a struggling Texas settler family, in 1876, risks everything to save a Comanche warrior, sparking a chain of events that could reshape a blood-stained frontier. His courage challenges deep-seated enmity, but what price will his family pay? Will his act forge peace or ignite a firestorm? Subscribe to uncover this tale of grit and hope, and share where you're tuning in from. Can a child's compassion mend a divided land? Will vengeance or understanding prevail? Stay to find out if Ethan's choice rewrites the Texas plains or buries them in ash. The Texas sun blazed like a branding iron, scorching the cracked earth of the prairie in 1876. Ethan Callahan, an 11-year-old with sun-browned skin and eyes sharp as a hawk's, nudged a handful of scrawny cattle along a dry creek bed. His patched shirt clung to his slight frame, sweat beading on his brow, while hand-me-down jeans from a brother long gone flapped loose on his hips. The Callahan Ranch, a stubborn patch of dirt clawed from the wilderness, was all his family had left. His father, Tom, a one-armed Civil War veteran, carried a hatred for the Comanche as fierce as the heat, blaming them for the raid that stole James, Ethan's older brother, 2 summers back. To Tom, every Comanche was a shadow to be shot, but Ethan, too young to bear such venom, saw only the endless sky and the dust under his boots. Riding Rusty, a sway-backed pony with more grit than grace, Ethan kicked up red clouds that stung his eyes. His father's words echoed like a distant storm. "Stay sharp, boy. Comanches don't forgive, and neither do I." But Ethan's mind drifted, tracing cloud shapes or the shimmer of heat rising from brittle grass. He'd heard the tales, Comanche warriors striking like lightning, leaving blood and ash in their wake. Yet at 11, he was more boy than soldier, his world bound by the creak of his saddle and the lowing of cattle. His mother, Sarah, had packed him a biscuit and a strip of jerky, her worried eyes lingering as he rode out. "You're too small for this," she'd muttered, but Ethan flashed a grin, eager to prove himself. The creek bed snaked through rolling hills, grass crunching underfoot like old bones. Ethan's slingshot, tucked in his belt, was his only weapon, useless against anything bigger than a jackrabbit. Tom's old carbine stayed home. He didn't trust a boy with a gun, not yet. The ranch sprawled across hard-won acres, its sagging fences a testament to the family's fading hopes. Comanche raids had grown bolder, rustlers prowled, and every day was a fight to keep what little they had. Ethan's job was simple: check the herd, patch any fence breaks, and get home before dusk. But the prairie was no place for a boy alone, and the air hummed with a warning, like the earth itself was whispering trouble. As Ethan crested a low rise, the ground trembled, a low rumble swelling into a roar. Dust bloomed on the horizon, a red haze swallowing the sky. His heart kicked hard. Buffalo, hundreds of them, their hooves pounding the earth into a quaking fury. He'd seen herds before, but this was a beast of its own, a dark tide of muscle and horn, unstoppable. Rusty snorted, hooves dancing, sensing the chaos. Ethan's eyes narrowed, scanning the storm of dust, and then he saw it. A figure, not running with the herd, but trapped against it, pinned by a jagged outcrop of rock. A man, his horse gone, his body braced as the buffalo surged closer, their bellows shaking the air. Ethan's breath caught. The man's buckskin clothes and braided hair marked him as Comanche, the very shadow his father cursed. "Never trust 'em," Tom's voice growled in his mind. "They'd cut your throat and laugh." But the man's eyes, wide with desperation, locked on the herd, then flicked to Ethan, a raw, human plea. The boy's hands tightened on Rusty's reins, his pulse a drumbeat. "Run!" his fear screamed, Right away. This was his enemy, the kind who'd killed James. Yet something deeper stirred, a spark of defiance against his father's hate, a stubborn need to act before the prairie claimed another life. The herd was close now, their musky scent thick, their hooves a thunder that drowned out thought. Ethan spurred Rusty forward, the pony's hooves kicking up dirt as they charged toward the rock. The herd was a wall of chaos, close enough to taste the dust, to feel the heat of their breath. His small hands shook, but his mind raced, sharp as a blade. No rifle, no rope, only a boy's quick wit, and a heart too stubborn to turn back. The warrior was yards away, his back pressed to the stone, one leg caught, his face taut with pain and resolve. Ethan didn't know his name, didn't know why he was here. But he knew one thing. If he did nothing, the man would die. The prairie held its breath, and Ethan, a boy too small for heroes, rode straight into the storm. The prairie held its breath, and Ethan Callahan, a boy too small for heroes, rode straight into the storm. The Texas horizon churned with dust in 1876, the buffalo herd a roiling beast of horn and hide, its thunder shaking the earth like a war drum gone mad. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs, his small hands gripping Rusty's reins, as the pony snorted, hooves skittering on the cracked ground. The Comanche warrior, pinned against a jagged rock, was a shadow in the haze, his braided hair whipping in the wind, his eyes locked on the charging herd. Ethan didn't know his name, but those eyes, fierce, desperate, human, burned into him, drowning out his father's warnings. The herd was a living wall now, close enough to choke on their musky stink, their bellows vibrating through Ethan's bones. Rusty's ears flicked back, the pony trembling beneath him, but Ethan urged him closer, the gap between boy and warrior shrinking with every heartbeat. The man's leg was trapped under a slab, blood seeping through torn buckskin, his face a mask of pain and defiance. Ethan's slingshot, tucked in his belt, was a match for this chaos, and his mind raced for a plan. No rope, no gun, just a boy's wits, and a stubborn spark that refused to let death win. He scanned the terrain, eyes darting over sagebrush and scattered stones. A rusted tin bucket, half buried in the dirt, glinted in the sun's glare. Ethan leaped from Rusty, his boots hitting the ground hard, and sprinted to the bucket, yanking it free. The herd was yards away, their hooves a deafening roar. He grabbed a fistful of dry grass, his fingers fumbling with the flint in his pocket. A spark caught, then another, and flames licked the grass, sending up a plume of acrid smoke. Ethan slammed the bucket against the rock, the clang sharp as a gunshot, slicing through the herd's rumble. The buffalo on the edge veered, startled, their massive bodies parting like a river around a stone. Ethan bolted to the warrior, dust stinging his eyes, his breath ragged. "Hold on!" he shouted, voice swallowed by the din. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the dirt around the slab, his hands scraping raw against sharp edges. Blood welled from his palms, mixing with the red earth, but he didn't stop. The warrior's eyes, wide with disbelief, met Ethan's, a flicker of hope in their depths. The boy shoved against the slab, his skinny arms straining, muscles burning. It budged, just enough. The warrior yanked his leg free, grimacing, and Ethan grabbed his arm, pulling with a strength he didn't know he had. They stumbled back, collapsing behind the outcrop as the herd roared past, hooves missing them by inches. The ground trembled beneath them, the air thick with dust, and the herd's fading thunder. Ethan lay gasping, his chest heaving, the warrior beside him breathing hard. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his buckskin stained with blood and dirt, beads in his braided hair glinting faintly. "Kauno," he rasped, his English broken but clear. "You brave heart." Ethan blinked, stunned that the warrior spoke his tongue. "I'm Ethan," he said, pointing to himself, voice shaky but firm. The man nodded, touching his chest. "Dakota." The dust settled, the prairie falling into an eerie quiet, broken only by Rusty's nervous snort nearby. Ethan staggered to his feet, his legs wobbly, and offered a hand to Dakota. The warrior's grip was strong, but his eyes held something softer. Gratitude, maybe, or respect. Blood trickled from Ethan's torn hands, the gash on his palm stinging like fire. Dakota's leg was bloodied, but not broken, his strength returning as he leaned against the rock. The sun dipped lower, painting the prairie in hues of gold and shadow. Ethan glanced at the horizon, the weight of his choice settling like a stone in his gut. Saving a Comanche, his father's sworn enemy, could brand him a traitor in Tom's eyes. Yet, as he looked at Dakota, alive and standing, Ethan felt no regret, only a spark of something new, a bridge he didn't fully understand. The prairie stretched wide, its silence heavy with secrets. Ethan mounted Rusty, Dakota limping beside him, his steps slow but steady. Far off, a faint glow flickered, a signal fire, its light dancing against the dusk. Ethan's pulse quickened. The Comanche were coming, drawn by the boy's act of mercy. As the horizon swallowed the last of the sun, Ethan knew this was no longer just a boy's errand. The storm he'd ridden into was only the beginning, and the Texas plains were about to test a courage too big for his small frame. The storm he'd ridden into was only the beginning, and the Texas plains were about to test a courage too big for his small frame. As dusk bled into the sky in 1876, Ethan Callahan trudged toward the Callahan Ranch, his hands raw and bloodied, Rusty's reins loose in his grip. Dakota, the Comanche warrior he'd saved, limped beside him, his buckskin torn, his face etched with pain but alive. The prairie's silence was heavy, broken only by the crunch of their steps and the distant flicker of a signal fire. Ethan's heart thudded, each beat a reminder of the choice that could unravel his world. Saving a Comanche was no small thing, not when his father's hate burned hotter than the Texas sun. The ranch came into view, its sagging cabin a frail speck against the vast plain. A lantern glowed in the window, casting a warm light that felt like a lie. Ethan's boots scuffed the dirt as he hesitated at the door, his torn hands stinging, the gash on his palm crusted with blood. Dakota paused, his dark eyes scanning the horizon, where the fire's glow pulsed like a warning. "Your people," he said, his voice low, halting in English. "They will not understand." Ethan swallowed, his throat dry as the creek bed. "Pa won't," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't let you die." Inside, Sarah was kneading dough, her hands steady but her eyes sharp with worry. Tom sat by the hearth, his one arm cradling a whiskey bottle, his face a map of grief and scars. "You're late, boy," he growled, not looking up. Ethan's breath caught, his small frame filling the doorway. "Pa, I helped a man today. A Comanche. He was trapped." Tom's head snapped up, his eyes like flint sparking fire. "You what?" His voice was a blade, cutting through the room's warmth. Sarah dropped her dough, her hands flying to her mouth, her gaze darting to the window where the fire's glow grew brighter. Ethan stepped forward, his voice trembling but firm. "He was gonna die, Pa. I couldn't just leave him." Tom staggered to his feet, his one hand gripping the whiskey bottle like a weapon. "Comanches killed your brother, Ethan, and you save one?" His words were venom, his face twisting with betrayal. Sarah moved to Ethan's side, her hand on his shoulder, but her eyes were on the window, wide with fear. "Tom, hush," she whispered. "Something's coming." The air thickened, the distant rumble of hooves growing louder, not the wild charge of a raid, but steady, deliberate, like a storm rolling in slowly. Ethan peered through the cracked window, his pulse hammering. Shadows moved against the firelight, tall and proud, their horses snorting clouds in the cool night air. Over 100 Comanche warriors fanned out before the cabin, their silhouettes stark against the dusk. At their head rode a man, older, his headdress simpler than a war chief's, his bearing calm but commanding. Beside him was Dakota, limping but upright, his buckskin stained. Ethan's stomach twisted. This was no war party, but their presence pressed like a gathering thunderhead. Tom grabbed his carbine, his one hand shaking. "Comanches," he spat, moving for the door. Ethan blocked his path, his small frame rigid. "Pa, wait. They ain't raidin'. I saved one of them. They're here to talk." Tom's face was a storm, his hand tightening on the gun. "Talk? With Comanches? You've gone soft, boy." Sarah's grip on Ethan's shoulder tightened, her voice a plea. "Let him speak, Tom." Outside, the leader dismounted, his movements deliberate, and raised a hand, palm open. "I am Maka, chief of the Wandering Wolf Band," he called, his English rough but clear, learned from traders. "Your boy saved my son, Dakota. Comanche law binds us to honor this." Tom's grip on the carbine faltered, his eyes flicking to Ethan, then to Maka. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his boots scuffing the wood, his torn hands clenched. "Is Dakota okay?" he asked, his voice small but steady. Maka's eyes, dark as the prairie night, softened. "He lives because of you, boy. You and your kin are under our protection now." Sarah gasped, clutching Ethan closer. "Protection? From Comanches?" Maka nodded, his warriors still as stone behind him. "No man of my band will harm you. This is our way." Ethan felt the weight of his father's gaze, the silver of Maka's words a shield against the storm brewing in Tom's heart. The prairie watched, its silence heavy, as the signal fire burned brighter, a beacon of a debt that could either save or doom them all. The prairie watched, its silence heavy, as the signal fire burned brighter, a beacon of a debt that could either save or doom them all. In the Texas dusk of 1876, Ethan Callahan stood on the sagging porch of the family ranch, his small frame dwarfed by the weight of what he'd done. The Comanche warriors, over 100 strong, fanned out before the cabin, their horses still, their faces unreadable in the firelight. Chief Maka's words, protection for Ethan's kin, hung in the air like smoke, but Tom Callahan's one hand still gripped his carbine, his eyes blazing with distrust. Ethan's torn hand stung, blood crusting in the cool night air, but it was his father's wrath he feared most. Inside, the cabin's warmth felt brittle, the lantern's glow flickering like a faltering hope. Sarah clutched Ethan's shoulder, her breath uneven, her eyes darting between her son and the warriors outside. "Tom, please," she whispered, her voice a threadbare plea. "They ain't here to fight." Tom's face was a storm, his voice low and raw. "You don't know him, Sarah. They took James. This boy's gone and stirred a hornet's nest." Ethan's chest tightened, his voice small but steady. "I saved a man, Pa, that's all." Tom's gaze bore into him, a mix of fury and something softer. Doubt? Maybe. Or a flicker of pride he wouldn't admit. Maka stood tall, his headdress glinting faintly, his voice carrying over the prairie's hum. "Your boy has a warrior's heart," he said, gesturing to Dakota, who limped forward, his leg bandaged but his bearing proud. "Comanche law is clear. A life saved demands honor. No blade of the wandering wolf will touch you." Ethan's pulse raced, his eyes flicking to Dakota, whose nod was a silent vow. The warrior's presence wasn't a threat, but a promise, one that could shift the ground beneath the Callahan's feet. Yet the signal fire's glow pulsed brighter, and Ethan knew word of this would spread, like sparks catching dry grass. Tom lowered his carbine an inch, his jaw tight. Your word doesn't erase blood, Maka. My boy's young, foolish. He doesn't know what he's done. Ethan stepped forward, his boots scuffing the porch, his torn hands clenched. I ain't a fool, Pa. I saw a man dying. I did what was right. Sarah's grip tightened, her eyes welling, but she stayed silent, her faith in Ethan a quiet anchor. Maka's gaze softened, his voice steady as granite. Right is rare in this land, boy. You've given us a story worth telling. If stories of courage move you, join us. Subscribe to hear more of the frontier's heart, where grit and honor clash. Share where you're listening from. Your spark keeps these tales alive. The night deepened, the prairie's silence broken by a new sound. Hoofbeats, fast and angry, from the south. Ethan's stomach dropped. Word had reached the settlers, men with guns and grudges as old as Tom's. The Comanches stood calm, their horses snorting, but Ethan felt the air thicken, a storm brewing beyond the firelight. Sarah pulled him closer, her voice a whisper. Lord help us, Ethan. What have you brought down on us? Tom's hand twitched on the carbine, his eyes scanning the darkness. They're coming for blood, he muttered, his voice a growl. Ethan's heart pounded, but he stood firm, the weight of Maka's promise a shield against the fear clawing his insides. The hoofbeats grew louder, a rumble like the buffalo herd Ethan had faced hours before. Shadows emerged from the night, riders, maybe 40, their rifles glinting in the fire's glow. At their head was Sheriff Marcus Briggs, a man hardened by loss, his wife and daughter taken in a raid years back. His eyes, cold as iron, swept over the Comanche camp, then locked on Tom. Callahan, he barked, dismounting, his hand on his revolver. You've got savages on your land. Explain yourself. Tom stepped onto the porch, his carbine low but ready. My boy saved one of them. They claim they're here to honor it, not fight. Briggs's gaze snapped to Ethan, his lip curling. A boy? Harboring Comanches? You're either fools or traitors. Maka raised a hand, his voice cutting through the tension. We are wandering wolf, not your enemy. This boy saved my son. We owe him. Briggs laughed, a harsh, grating sound. Owe him. Your kind only knows blood. Ethan's hands clenched, his torn palms stinging, his small voice rising. They ain't lying, Sheriff. I saw Dakota trapped. I couldn't let him die. The militia stirred, their rifles gleaming, their faces a mix of rage and doubt. The prairie held its breath, the fire's glow dancing on the warriors' beadwork, the cabin a fragile speck in a land ready to ignite. Ethan's act of mercy had lit a fuse, and the night was about to explode. Ethan's act of mercy had lit a fuse, and the night was about to explode. The Texas prairie, cloaked in the chill of 1876, held its breath as Sheriff Marcus Briggs' militia fanned out before the Callahan ranch, their rifles catching the glow of the Comanche signal fire. Ethan stood on the sagging porch, his small frame rigid, his bloodied hands clenched against the fear clawing his gut. The wandering wolf warriors, over 100 strong, stood calm behind Chief Maka, their horses snorting clouds into the night air. Tom Callahan gripped his carbine, his one arm trembling, while Sarah's prayers whispered from the doorway, her eyes wide with dread. Briggs dismounted, his boots kicking up red dust, his face a mask of grief and fury. His wife and daughter, lost to a raid 3 years back, fueled a hatred as unyielding as the plains. Callahan, he snarled, his hand hovering over his revolver. You've got one chance to explain why your land's crawling with Comanches. Tom's voice was rough as gravel. My boy saved their man. They claim they're here to honor it, not raid. Briggs's eyes snapped to Ethan, cold and sharp as a blade. A kid? You let a kid bring this trouble to our doorstep? His words cut, but Ethan held his ground, his torn palms stinging as he faced the sheriff. Maka stepped forward, his headdress glinting faintly, his voice steady as the granite hills. We are wandering wolf, not iron horse. Your hate blinds you, Sheriff. This boy saved my son, Dakota. Our law binds us to protect him. Dakota limped to his father's side, his bandaged legs steady, his eyes fierce but calm. Iron Horse raids and hides, leaving us to face your bullets, he said, his English halting but clear. Briggs laughed, a bitter sound that sliced the night. Your kind's all the same, thieves and killers. Don't feed me lies. The militia stirred, their rifles twitching, fingers itching for a fight. Ethan's heart pounded, the air thick with the threat of blood. He saw the settlers' faces. Some burned with rage, others flickered with doubt, their rifles dipping slightly. They ain't lying, Sheriff, Ethan said, his voice cracking but firm, stepping off the porch into the firelight. I saw Dakota trapped. He'd be dead if I didn't act. Ain't that worth something? Briggs's gaze narrowed, his hand still on his revolver. But a ripple passed through the militia, a few men exchanging glances, their anger wavering. Sarah's hand reached for Ethan, but he stood fast, a boy caught between two worlds, teetering on the edge of violence. A young militiaman, Caleb, broke the silence, his face twisted with fury. Enough talk, he shouted, raising his rifle toward Maka. Time slowed, the night holding its breath. Ethan's instincts, honed by years dodging danger on the prairie, kicked in. He snatched a stone from the dirt, his slingshot aim true, and hurled it. The rock struck Caleb's wrist, sharp and sure, sending the rifle firing wild, the bullet burying itself in the earth. The shot echoed like thunder, a spark in a powder keg. Both sides tensed, militia gripping rifles, Comanches reaching for knives. But Maka raised a hand, his voice calm as stone. Hold! The warriors froze, their discipline a wall against chaos. Briggs's eyes widened, his hand frozen on his revolver, realizing Ethan's quick throw had saved him from a stray bullet. You're a fool, boy, he growled, but his voice lacked its earlier venom. Ethan's chest heaved, his small frame dwarfed by the armed men. No one needs to die tonight, he said, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. Can't we talk? The prairie's silence pressed down, the fire's glow dancing on the warriors' beadwork, the militia's rifles gleaming. Tom stepped beside Ethan, his carbine lowered, his face a war of doubt and pride. Maka's gaze met Briggs, unflinching. This boy sees men, not enemies. His courage saved my son, and now you. Will you let hate burn this land? Briggs's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to Ethan, then to his men, some of whom now looked uncertain, their rifles sagging. The Comanches stood unarmed, their faces stoic, their presence a challenge to the settlers' fear. Ethan felt the weight of every eye, his torn hands a quiet testament to his defiance. The night was a tinderbox, and his small act had cracked the wall of hate, but one wrong move could still turn the ranch to ash. As the fire burned low, the hoofbeats of more riders echoed faintly from the south, a new threat stirring in the darkness. The night was a tinderbox, and Ethan's small act had cracked the wall of hate, but one wrong move could still turn the ranch to ash. Dawn broke over the Texas plains in 1876, a thin gold light spilling across the Callahan ranch, but the air was thick with menace. Ethan stood on the sagging porch, his bloodied hands clenched, his small frame caught between the Comanche camp and the militia's gleaming rifles. The wandering wolf warriors, their hide tents sprawled beyond the fence, stood watchful under Chief Maka's steady gaze. Dakota, bandaged but unbowed, scanned the horizon where dust rose like a storm. Sheriff Marcus Briggs's militia, 40 strong, faced them, their horses snorting, their faces set with grim resolve. Inside, Tom Callahan gripped his carbine, his one arm trembling, his face a map of old scars and new doubts. Sarah wrung a dishcloth, her whispered prayers barely audible, her eyes darting between Ethan and the approaching threat. "They'll call us traitors," Tom growled, his voice raw. Ethan met his father's gaze, his voice small but steady. "I saved a man, Pa. That ain't treason." Before Tom could reply, the ground shook with the thunder of hooves. Briggs, hardened by the loss of his wife and daughter, led the militia, his eyes like cold iron as he dismounted, boots kicking up red dust. "Tom Callahan," he barked, hand on his revolver. "You've got Comanches on your land? Speak, or we'll burn this place down." Tom stepped forward, his carbine lowered but ready. "My boy saved one of them. They're here to honor that, not fight." Briggs's gaze snapped to Ethan, his lip curling. "A boy? Harboring savages? Your fools are worse." The militia spread out, their rifles glinting, fingers twitching on triggers. The Comanches stood their ground, unarmed, their faces stoic but tense. Maka raised a hand, his voice cutting through the morning chill. "We come in peace, Sheriff. This boy saved my son. Our law protects him now." Briggs laughed, a harsh sound that grated like rusty iron. "Your law means nothing. You're the Iron Horse Band, raiders who killed my family." Dakota stepped forward, his limp not hiding his defiance. "We are Wandering Wolf, not Iron Horse. Your hate blinds you. Iron Horse strikes, then vanishes, leaving us to face your wrath." Ethan saw a shift in the militia. Some men's eyes flickered, their rifles dipping, as if Dakota's words stirred doubt. But Briggs's face was stone, his hand still on his revolver. "Lies," he snarled. "You're all the same." Ethan's heart pounded, the air thick with the threat of violence. He stepped off the porch, his boots crunching dirt, his small voice rising. "They ain't lying, Sheriff. I saw Dakota trapped. Would you let a man die?" Briggs's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak, Caleb, the hot-headed militiaman, raised his rifle again, his face twisted with fury. "No more talk," he shouted, aiming at Maka. Time slowed, the prairie holding its breath. Ethan's instincts kicked in, his hand snatching a stone from the ground. His slingshot aim, honed by years of fending off coyotes, was true. The rock struck Caleb's wrist, sharp and swift, sending the rifle firing wild, the bullet kicking up dirt. The shot echoed, a spark in a powder keg, and both sides tensed, militia gripping rifles, Comanche's hands twitching toward knives. Maka's voice boomed, steady as granite. "Hold!" His warriors froze, their discipline a wall against chaos. Briggs's hand froze on his revolver, his eyes wide, realizing Ethan's throw had saved him from a stray bullet. "You're a damn fool, boy," he growled, but his voice wavered, the edge blunted. Ethan stood between the militia and the Comanches, his chest heaving, his torn hands trembling. "No one's got to die today," he said, his voice cracking but firm. "Can't we just talk?" the militia murmured, some rifles sagging, their faces troubled by the boy's words. Tom's carbine dipped, his eyes on Ethan, a flicker of pride breaking through his storm of doubt. Maka faced Briggs, his gaze unflinching. "This boy's heart sees no enemy, only men. Will you let his courage be for nothing?" Briggs's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking from Ethan to the unarmed Comanches, then to his men, some now hesitating, their anger fraying. The ranch stood fragile, a speck against the vast plains, and Ethan's act had shifted something, a crack in the wall of hate. But the distant hoofbeats grew louder, more settlers approaching, their guns loaded with fear. The morning light sharpened, casting long shadows across the tense standoff, and Ethan knew the fuse he'd lit was still burning, ready to spark a fire that could consume them all. The morning light sharpened, casting long shadows across the tense standoff, and Ethan knew the fuse he'd lit was still burning, ready to spark a fire that could consume them all. The Texas sun climbed high in 1876, its harsh glare bathing the Callahan ranch in a brittle glow. Ethan stood between the Comanche warriors and Sheriff Marcus Briggs's militia, his small frame a fragile dam against a flood of hate. The wandering wolf band, unarmed but resolute, held their ground behind Chief Maka, their faces carved with quiet defiance. Tom Callahan stood on the porch, his carbine lowered, his one hand flexing as pride and doubt warred in his eyes. Sarah's prayers whispered from the doorway, her hands trembling, her faith in Ethan the only thing keeping her steady. Briggs's face was a storm, his hand still on his revolver, but his eyes betrayed a crack in his armor. Ethan's stone-throwing act, disarming Caleb's wild shot, had saved him from a bullet, and the boy's words, "No one's gotta die today," hung heavy in the air. Maka's voice, steady as the granite hills, cut through the silence. "This boy sees men, not enemies. His courage saved my son, and now you, Sheriff. Will you let hate burn this land?" Briggs's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering from Ethan to the Comanches, then to his men, some of whose rifles now sagged, their faces troubled by doubt. Ethan's torn hands throbbed, blood crusted in the lines of his palms, but he stood firm, his voice rising again. "I ain't a traitor, Sheriff. I just did what was right." His words were a boy's, simple but sharp, cutting through the morning's heat. Briggs's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, the memory of his lost wife and daughter warring with the truth before him. "You're a fool, boy," he said, his voice rough but quieter, the venom drained. He turned to Maka. "You ain't Iron Horse, I'll give you that. But this doesn't erase the past." Maka nodded, his headdress glinting in the sun. "The past is blood. The future can be different. This boy shows us how." Maka stepped forward, his movements deliberate, and knelt before Ethan, pulling a silver band etched with a wolf's head from his wrist. "You are a friend to the wandering wolf," he said, his voice low but resonant. "Wear this, and no Comanche will harm you." Ethan's hands trembled as he took the band, its metal cool against his bloodied skin. Tom stepped closer, his face a tangle of emotions. "You're giving my boy your word?" he asked, his voice gruff. Maka met his gaze, unflinching. "A life debt is sacred. Your son is our kin now." Sarah's eyes welled, her hand clutching Ethan's shoulder, her voice a whisper. "My brave boy." The militia murmured, some nodding, others still wary, their rifles half raised. Briggs raised a hand, silencing them. "One day," he said, his voice hard but weary. "You've got till sundown to clear out. I can't hold these men back longer." Maka nodded, his warriors already moving to break camp, their motions swift but calm. Dakota approached Ethan, his limp less pronounced, his eyes warm. "Kauno," he said, clasping Ethan's shoulder, a warrior's gesture. "You gave me life. Now we give you peace." He handed Ethan a small beaded pouch, its patterns intricate, a token of courage. The Comanches mounted their horses, their silhouettes stark against the rising sun. As the warriors rode out, the silver band gleamed on Ethan's wrist, its weight heavier than its metal. The militia dispersed, their hoofbeats fading into the prairie's hum. Briggs lingered, his eyes on Ethan, his voice low. "You've got guts, kid," he said, almost a whisper. "But you've stirred trouble that won't settle easy." He mounted and rode off, leaving the Callahans in a silence thick with change. Tom looked at Ethan, his one hand flexing, searching for words. "You did right, boy," he said finally, his voice gruff but softer, a crack in his wall of hate. Sarah hugged Ethan, her tears damp on his hair, her voice trembling. You're my heart, Ethan. The ranch stood quiet, the Comanche camp gone, but their promise lingered like a seed in the cracked earth. Ethan's act had shifted something, a fragile hope planted in blood-soaked soil. The prairie stretched wide, its scars hidden under new grass, but the distant hoofbeats still echoed, a reminder that the settlers' fear hadn't faded. Ethan's courage had cracked open a door to peace, but the plains were unforgiving, and the boy knew this was only the beginning of a reckoning that could reshape the frontier or break it. Ethan's courage had cracked open a door to peace, but the plains were unforgiving, and the boy knew this was only the beginning of a reckoning that could reshape the frontier or break it. Days later, under the relentless Texas sun of 1876, Ethan Callahan stood by the dry creek bed, the silver band on his wrist, glinting like a star caught in the daylight. The prairie stretched wide, its scars hidden beneath new grass, but the air still carried the weight of that tense dawn. The Comanches were gone, their hide tents vanished like smoke, yet their promise lingered, a fragile seed planted in blood-soaked soil. Ethan's torn hands had healed to faint scars, but the weight of his choice pressed heavier than ever. The Callahan ranch stood quiet, its sagging fences a testament to years of struggle. Inside the cabin, Sarah moved with a lighter step, her eyes softer when they fell on Ethan, as if seeing him anew. Tom, though, was a storm still settling. His one hand lingered on his carbine, his gaze often drifting to the horizon. But his words to Ethan had changed. "You did right," he'd said that morning, his voice gruff but tinged with something new, respect, maybe, or a crack in the hate that had long defined him. Ethan felt it, a shift in the air, like the prairie itself was exhaling after holding its breath too long. He fingered the beaded pouch Dakota had given him, its intricate patterns, a reminder of the warrior's words. For courage. The memory of Maka's silver band, etched with a wolf's head, burned in his mind, a symbol of a bond he barely understood, but felt deep in his bones. Ethan wasn't the boy he'd been a week ago, tending cattle with a slingshot, and dreams too big for his small frame. He'd faced death, defied hate, and stood between two worlds ready to tear each other apart. Now, the creek's faint trickle seemed to whisper back, urging him to hold fast to what he'd started. Word of Ethan's act had spread like wildfire through the settlements, carried by riders and whispers in saloons. Some called him a fool, others a traitor. But a few, old men who'd seen too much blood, women who'd buried sons, spoke of him with quiet awe. Sheriff Marcus Briggs, whose iron heart had softened under Ethan's defiance, rode quieter now, his orders to his men less sharp, his talk of vengeance muted. The militia hadn't returned, but their hoofbeats still echoed in Ethan's dreams, a reminder that peace was a fragile thing in a land carved by loss. He walked the ranch's edge, Rusty grazing nearby, the pony's sway-back silhouette a familiar comfort. The prairie was vast, its horizon endless, but Ethan felt its secrets shifting. A hawk circled above, its cry sharp against the silence, and Ethan wondered if the Comanches were watching, their promise of protection, a shadow on the plains. He'd heard talk in town, whispers of iron horse raiders striking further north, leaving blood and blame. The wandering wolf band, Maka's people, had kept their word, their absence some quiet testament to their honor. Tom joined him by the creek, his boots crunching the dry earth. "You changed something, boy," he said, his voice low, his one hand resting on Ethan's shoulder, a rare touch. "Don't know if it'll hold, but you made him see us different." Ethan nodded, the silver band cool against his wrist. "I just wanted to do right, Pa," he said, his voice steady. No longer a boy's, but not yet a man's. Tom's eyes, weathered by grief, held a flicker of pride. You did. But this land doesn't forgive easily. Sarah called them in for supper, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. As Ethan sat at the table, the lantern's glow cast long shadows, the cabin a small haven against the vast unknown. The prairie outside was still, but its silence wasn't empty. It hummed with possibility, with the chance that a boy's courage could outlast the hate that had soaked the soil. Ethan's act, saving Dakota, disarming Caleb, had sown a hope that peace might grow where blood had ruled. The Texas plains, unforgiving and wide, held their secrets close, but Ethan Callahan, once too small for heroes, had carved a new path, one that might lead to a dawn where no blood stained the earth. Ethan Callahan's courage, a boy's heart defying hate, sowed peace on the Texas plains. Did his choice to save a stranger stir your soul? Could you stand against fear for another? Share your thoughts below. Your voice keeps these frontier tales alive. I'm grateful to each of you for riding through this story of grit and hope, where a child's act reshaped a divided land. The lessons of the wild endure, and I look forward to meeting you again with another tale of bravery and redemption. Keep the spark of compassion burning until our next journey across the untamed plains. See you soon.